email me and or inbox me and just say you were at the Socratic seminar, so I remember to give you your points. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So, Masque of the Red Death. Masque of the Red Death. Here we go. These questions were taken from the discussion board. The answers were posted by students on the discussion board, and I just want to go over these questions and answers with you guys so we can talk about the questions. So what is Masque of the Red Death an allegory for? Let's see. And here's the answer. I think it is no one can escape death. Do you both agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, great. An allegory is a story that usually has two different levels of meaning. It's got a literal level of meaning, and it's got a figurative level of meaning or an implied meaning. And and Mrs. Campbell is going to give us a definition of allegory a little later on. That's very good. That will, I think, cement in our minds what allegory is. So, what do each of the following represent? Prince Prospero. Prince Prospero, someone who is very wise and arrogant, though. Is Prince Prospero both wise and arrogant? How is he arrogant? Any answers? Okay, well, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. One student said that he's arrogant because he thinks that he can separate himself from the rest of the population with the wealthiest people of the town and avoid the common human experience of suffering, which in this case is the Red Death. And he's also arrogant because he attempts to kill the Red Death character. The mass fall. All the people were already infected. That may be true. The colors of the 7 rooms. I think it was the steps of how the disease began. People were happy, and over a small amount of time, people became devastated, like the black and red room. I think what this person, the student, is trying to say is that each of the rooms represents a different stage in life. And we'll talk more about that later. The 7th room itself, this student says, I think that just represented death and war. Do you agree with that? Do you think the 7th room represents death?
I think part of the problem, Aurelie, Sean, and Bianca, your mics are all off. So we want to make sure that you're participating in this. So we do want you to jump in. Thank you, Sean. Sean is going to be answering from the chat box, and that's perfectly acceptable. Just make sure you are responding to the questions, please.
Okay, hey, Sean, Bianca, Aurelie, and Alexis, great. Okay, so, I can't see both screens at the same time, so I'm just going to maybe depend on Mrs. Campbell to prompt me when someone makes a comment using a chat box, if that would be okay.
Sure. So Sean said, yes, I would agree.
Okay,
But
great.
why would you agree, Sean? What is it about that seventh room that is symbolizing death? What about anybody else who's there? Anybody else? Why does the last room symbolize death? There we go. Because the final room has a dark and creepy room that gives the sense of death and the end of life. Good.
Great point. Yeah. Hey, very good. Now the ebony clock. What about that? Time was of how much time they had left. That's good. And the masked figure. It came like the night. No one knew it was the death because people were also careless. And I think careless is actually a really good word here because the maskers um, had very few cares. They weren't worried about the illness because they were separated from most of the population. How have the guests tried to avoid their fate? They tried leaving the cities. And what does Prospero neglect to realize? He neglects to realize that he is selfish, especially because he tries killing death itself. He did not realize he can hurt himself and others. Do you agree with that statement that he's selfish? Okay.
Why don't
We'll
we pick somebody? We're going to have to throw them under the bus, I think. Alexis,
Okay.
what do you think?
I would say he is more arrogant and selfish. Okay, good point. Good point. What do you think, Alexis?
I think
The question is, what does Prince Prospero neglect to realize? The answer here is that selfish. Because he tries to kill death itself, he does not realize he can hurt himself or others. Do you agree with that?
yes, I agree.
Okay, great. All right. We're going to move on to this slide. What is Masque of the Red Death an allegory for? I want to talk a little bit about a particular kind of irony called cosmic irony. And cosmic irony is when a character tries to avoid his or her fate and does something in doing that that brings on his or her inevitable fate. And this is the case in Oedipus Rex as well as in Masque of the Red Death. So let me tell you a little bit about Oedipus Rex. Oedipus Rex is a play, it's an ancient Greek play. It's one play that is part of a trilogy of plays by Sophocles. And Oedipus is this prince who grows up in this city-state called Corinth. And there that says that he is going to kill his own father. And as he grows up and gets old enough to leave Corinth, he decides to leave because he doesn't want to kill his father. And so he's leaving his father behind so he doesn't kill him. As he's walking along, he comes across this area where there are three roads that unite, that converge also. And it's called the Crossroads. And there's a lot of symbolism associated with Crossroads. There's actually a movie with Ralph Macchio made called Crossroads. And anyhow, he's at the crossroads, and there is a wagon full of men that drives by, and this wagon runs Oedipus off the road, and he's a prince, and he's walking, and someone in the wagon hits him in the head with a stick, and he's so enraged that he jumps into the wagon and he kills all the men except for one. And it isn't later, it's later. It's later when he finally realizes that he was not born in Corinth. He was only raised there. He was adopted by the king and queen as their prince, but he wasn't their child. And so all the time that he was running away from Corinth, running away from his father, he wasn't really running away from his real father, because his real father was one of the men in the wagon whom he killed. And so we can see that this is cosmic irony, because in attempting to run away from his prophesied fate, he actually did something to bring it on. He actually killed his real father without even knowing it. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And Bianca
Great.
says yes also.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So it's cosmic irony. It's one of the 5 types of irony. And so we see this in Masque of the Red Death also. And we see it in the sense that Prospero, in attempting to avoid his own death, and in attempting to destroy the idea of death, who is in the form of this walking corpse, the Red Death figure, Prospero destroys himself, because as he takes the knife up to kill the Red Death figure, he drops dead. And so in attempting to avoid death, to kill the idea of death, symbolically here, he actually kills himself. He brings his own fate on. So there is a little connection for you between Oedipus Rex and Masque of the Red Death. Okay, what or who does Prince Prospero represent? Now there's this big word, and the word is nomenclature. Some people say nomenclature. It doesn't really matter, but nomenclature is a big word that means how a character is named. You know, Charles Dickens is really good at using lots of great names for his characters. Like he has this teacher named Mr. Gradgrind. And you can imagine what kind of a teacher Mr. Gradgrind would be by his name. And he would be a really tough teacher. It would be a grind to get through his class. And so nomenclature means how a character is named. Now, thinking about Prince Prospero's name, what does Prospero bring to mind? The name Prospero. What does it sound like? What word does it sound like?
Prosperous.
That's right. It sounds like prosperous. And so that's very interesting about Prince Prospero and his nomenclature. Now, do you think that perhaps Prince Prospero's nomenclature is ironic in any way? Does his name fit him in the context of the story, or does his name not fit him in the context of the story? Is he ultimately prosperous, or is he not prosperous?
Sean says yes.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, so he's prosperous. He is prosperous for a time. But what ultimately happens to him? How prosperous is he in the end? Okay, so he's not, right? So his name, Prince Prospero, it's kind of ironic in the context of the end of the story. All right.
So Sean
Now,
says because he tried to be prosperous by keeping his people alive, but he is the downfall of his people.
that's exactly right. Well said, Sean. Very good. Very good. Blue, what is the allegorical significance of the colors of the seven rooms? What is the allegorical significance of the colors of the seven rooms? All right, now we can see that the first room is blue. And one thing that's interesting about the blue room is that it is the westernmost room. Now, when we think about the West, what do we think of? No, the blue room is the easternmost room. When we think about the East, what do we think of? What happens in the East every morning?
The sun rises.
That's right, the sun rises. Okay, now if we were going to associate the sun rising with a stage of human life, which stage of human life do you associate the sun rising with? Would it be like middle age, or would it be like old age, or what would it be?
The very beginning.
That's right. That's right, the very beginning. And so isn't it interesting? The blue room is the easternmost room. And as the colored rooms move along, each one represents a particular stage of life in human existence. And so, which room is the westernmost room, do you think? What happens in the West every night? At the end of every day?
The sun sets.
That's right, the sun sets. The sun sets in the West, and which room is the westernmost room?
The black room.
That's right. And why is that appropriate? How is that significant? Why is it appropriate?
The sun sets, which gives. Okay, I have to move this little note here. The sun sets, which gives the impression of the end because of the darkness the setting sun brings. That was from Sean, and Bianca says because that means the end of their life.
That's right. Both great answers. Those are both great answers. And isn't it interesting that the clock, which stops, is in the black room, indicating the end of time, just like the end of day is a kind of end of a time. The end of a life is the end of a time. Okay, the seventh room. What covers the walls in the seventh room? You know, there are these things that
Here it
cover
is.
windows.
Okay. Sean has added the scarlet tapestries, I believe.
Okay. Well, you're half right, Sean. They are actually black velvet tapestries or drapes that cover the walls in the seventh room. Now, the scarlet color is in that room, and you're correct about that. And so that leads me to the next question. What color are the windows?
Scarlet.
That's
what
right.
Sean said.
Good. Good. Now, what we're told is that there's a fire that casts blood red lights on the windows. So the windows are scarlet or they're blood red, and blood is a very, very, very important part of Masque of the Red Death, and we'll talk about that a little later. Now, the seventh room is very sparsely populated. There are very few people in it as compared to the other rooms in the palace, and probably that's because it's so dank, dark, and creepy. Okay, the ebony clock. What does the clock sound like when it strikes? Is it loud? Is it soft? Does anyone know?
I wish Canvas told us, you know, how your messaging service tells us when somebody else is typing. We don't get that, so it's hard for us to know.
Yeah.
And by the way, for everybody who's here, I know you may not like the sound of yourself recorded. You don't have to listen to this. The best part about being in the Socratic seminar is that you're done with. The other students are the ones who are going to have to listen to these recordings in order for them to participate. So if you just jump in with your answers, you'll never have to hear it if you don't want to.
Okay, so the clock is described as having a loud peal. Peal is a sound. And so let's move on to the next question, and maybe we get some more people answering. At what time does the clock strike its last? It's kind of an ominous time. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the change of one day to the next. Okay, it's 12 a.m.
Yep, midnight. Yep. Sean just got in midnight, just as you said that.
Oh, that's great, Sean. Thank you. Okay, so why is the detail of the clock perfect for the seventh room?
Let's hear from one of the ladies too, because we've heard quite a bit from. What about Aurelie? Aurelie, what do you think?
Maybe because it signifies or it symbolizes the end of life.
Excellent. That's very, very good. That's right. It symbolizes time, the end of a lifetime. It symbolizes the mortality of humans. And And you might remember that the clock actually stops. It strikes its last at midnight. So what does the clock as a symbol represent in the context story? And I think I just accidentally gave that one away. It represents mortality, the idea that we're all going to die, that we all have only a certain amount of time on Earth. And so that fits in nicely with the idea of the disease, the Red Death. So why does Poe make the clock an ebony clock? Now, the word ebony is one that you might not be familiar with. Ebony could be two things. It could be a very, very dark, almost black wood that's used on guitar fretboards and on the piano keyboard for the black keys, perhaps. And it can also signify just black, a black color. So why does Poe make the clock an ebony clock, a black clock?
Now, Sean posted this answer, and I didn't get a chance to share it, but it almost answers that question. The seventh room represents death, and the clock represents the time of life ticking by.
Oh, wow, that's great. That's great. It does answer that question in a sense because ebony is blackness, and in the context of this room, it represents death. And so we can tie the color of the dark color of ebony in with the mortality of man. Nicely said, Sean. Okay, all right. The masked figure. What about the masked figure angers Prince Prospero? What makes him angry at the masked figure that comes in, the figure of the Red Death? You know, it's interesting that all of these maskers and the prince, they're trying to avoid reality of the Red Death, the disease that's killing the town. But the masked figure reminds them of their own death that they're trying to avoid, because the masked figure looks like death. And the prince, in his arrogance, thinks he can avoid death. And that's why he wants to kill this masked figure, because it looks like what he's trying to avoid. So what really happens to the prince? He attempts to kill the masked figure. I think I may have mentioned it a little earlier, but I'm going to ask the question again.
He dies. Bianca says he dies. And so does Sean.
That's right. That's right. And so, what allegorical meaning could be applied to this fact?
In other words, kind of what the moral of the story is, I guess is what you could say.
That's right. Perhaps we could say something like, you can't kill death, death kills us. So, what is the significance of the face that the masked figure displays? What does the face look like of the mask?
By the way, Sean added, the meaning seems like it's saying you may try to fight it, but death always gets you. I like how you word that, Sean.
Yeah, so do I. Nicely said. And that is kind of what's happening in the story here. Overall, there's the avoidance of death, the attempted avoidance of death. So what is the significance of the face the masked figure displayed?
Look like a corpse.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It looks like a corpse. Okay, now, isn't it interesting that this figure's face foreshadows what the maskers will also look like very soon? Okay, how substantial or physical does the masked figure turn out to be? Is this masked figure a human being? What is this masked figure? So, Aurelie, what do you think?
I don't think that it is actually a person. I just think that maybe it's symbolic in a way that it's just kind of there.
Okay, good point. Good point. And you're absolutely right. Poe either saw this figure as symbolic or he saw it as a kind of phantom, a kind of evil spirit, perhaps, or death itself. Certainly not a human being. And we find out that there's actually nothing physical inside of the clothing the figure wears. And so it's a kind of phantom. Okay, so what is significant about the fact that there would have been no way for a person to get into the palace once it was locked? And so I think I'm going to answer this question because it's not really worded that well. That's my fault. But what I was getting at is the idea that these people, the Prince Prospero and all these people, have locked themselves inside the palace. And even though they have locked themselves inside the palace, this figure, this masked figure, gets in regardless because this masked figure is not human. It is some kind of phantom. So that's why the lock on the door is so important. That's why Pope puts that detail in there, because he wants to emphasize the fact that this masked figure is not just some regular person wearing a mask, but is death itself. Okay, so how have the
And Sean has added the significance is that you cannot lock death out.
Nicely said. Wow, that's great. That's right. Can't lock death out. Okay, so the guests. So how have the guests tried to avoid their fate? And I think we've already dealt with that question. They've locked themselves up in this palace. And how does cosmic irony apply here? I think we've already talked about that. And the answer would be that cosmic irony applies here because of the way in which Prospero tries to avoid or destroy death, but in the end, his fate is to die, which he does. So remember, the cosmic irony is doing something that brings about one's fate on, even though one's trying to avoid it. Okay, now, I think we've also answered this question too. What does Prince Prospero neglect to realize? He neglects to realize what Sean just said. You can't lock death out. Okay, we're going to skip that. And I want to talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe now, because understanding something about Poe's life will help you understand the significance of the symbolism and the imagery in the story. Now, Edgar Allan Poe always felt different from others. He saw women as angelic figures, and he loved his mother greatly. Poe's father abandoned his family when Edgar Allan Poe was only 1 year old, and his mother was an actress and was struck down by tuberculosis. Now, I don't know if you know much about tuberculosis, but tuberculosis is a disease of the lungs, and it causes hemorrhaging in the lungs, and people who get tuberculosis and die from it die because they drown in their own blood. And so the death was a terrible death. People would cough up lots of blood, and as they were dying, and it was a terrible sight to see. And young Edgar watched helplessly as his mother died, and he would have seen all of that terrible, gruesome sight. Edgar was only 3 years old when his mother died, and his mother was only 24 years old. She's very young, and she died of tuberculosis. Another name for tuberculosis is consumption. So if in your reading you come across the word consumption, it just means tuberculosis. 3 Poe children were scattered around to foster homes, and Edgar was taken in by the Allen family. So the Allen family was his foster family. And Mr. Allen raised Edgar with good schooling, a good education, and fine manners. Mrs. Allen gave Edgar lots of affection, and when Edgar was 15, Poe, or Edgar, swam 6 miles against the current in the James River. He was a very athletic and healthy young man. But wait until you see how his life changed. Poe was very sensitive, and his first love died of brain cancer. And Poe found himself weeping at her grave very often. Then Mrs. Allen, his foster mother, contracted tuberculosis. And while she was dying, her husband was being unfaithful to her, and Edgar knew about this, confronted him, and disagreed. In 1827, John Allen sent Edgar to the university to get Edgar out of the way because he didn't like the fact that Edgar had a conscience. And so at the university, Edgar's brilliance attracted lots of attention. Now, are we all still there?
I see them there. Yes,
Okay.
I got a couple yeses. There we go. Okay.
Great. Okay. Now, John Allen gave Poe, and that would be his foster father, gave Edgar Allan Poe just enough money to get to the university, but nothing for food. And so Poe tried gambling to make money, but found himself $2,000 a very good gambler. And his foster father wanted to disown him. But Poe resorted to breaking the furniture in his apartment to burn for firewood to stay warm, because his foster father would not send him any money for firewood or food. And so Poe didn't really have a choice. So he ran and joined the army under an assumed name or a pseudonym, because he was afraid of going into debtor's prison. You know, debtor's prison was a reality in the 1800s, and if you run up a lot of debt and couldn't pay for it, guess where you went? Went to prison. And you there until someone else paid for it, or perhaps you may have worked it off through manual labor. But Charles Dickens talks a lot of debtor's prison in one of his novels called Hard Times. Okay, so Poe went to Boston and he enlisted in the army as Edgar A. Perry because he didn't want to go to debtor's prison. And that's why he changed his name from Poe to Perry when he enlisted in the army. He even attended West Point for a time, and by the time he was 20 years old, he published 2 books of poetry with his own money. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In 1829, his foster mother died of tuberculosis. Okay. But tuberculosis, it's a terrible disease. It causes hemorrhaging in the lungs, coughing up copious amounts of blood. This affected him deeply. Now he had been orphaned by 2 mothers, his mother and Mrs. Allen, who he loved, and he had been rejected by 2 fathers. So, in 1831, he moved in with his aunt Maria Clem in Baltimore. Now, Poe had a hard time selling The Telltale Heart. That's the story about the guy who watches the old man with the crazy eye in the bedroom and eventually kills him and hides him under the floorboards of the house, but this man hears the heart beating still, so he's driven to madness by what he's done. And The Telltale Heart didn't sell easily because publishers thought it was too harsh. Now, when John Allen died, he left lots of money to all his illegitimate children, because you might recall that when his wife was dying of tuberculosis, he was having affairs. But he left nothing to Poe, his own fathered son. And so in 1835, Poe became the editor of a newspaper. And when Poe, as an editor, criticized literature, he was brutal. Now, Poe had a very combative personality, and he moved to Richmond. And Poe began to drink and crashed into a hard depression. And eventually, he married his first cousin, Virginia. Now, these days, if someone married their first cousin, it might be considered pretty strange. But back then, it may have been more common. Now, he was very devoted and loving as a husband, and Poe's life was a constant struggle to make enough money to survive. Poe never had very much money. Now, the themes of Poe's stories are rooted in the harsh reality of his life. In stories, he is obsessed with death, and we certainly see that in The Telltale Heart, the story I talked about. We certainly see it in The Masque of the Red Death, the story we've read. We see it also in The Raven. In many of his stories, he's obsessed with death. And he created the detective story, perhaps to attempt to find some order in life. Now, The Masque of the Dead perhaps strike closer to Poe's life than any other of his stories. Let's say that again. The Masque of the Red Death perhaps strikes closer to Poe's life than any other of his stories. Remember that tuberculosis, as I've said like 10 times already, causes coughing up of great quantity of blood. And this, for Poe, became the Red Death. So tuberculosis, for Poe, became the Red Death. That's why Masque of the Red Death is named what it is. So we could say Masque of Tuberculosis. When Poe wrote Masque of the Red Death, he had already lost his mother, his foster mother, and his brother to tuberculosis. And over the years, Virginia grew closer and closer. Virginia, that was his wife, his first cousin. And they would walk together in the garden, and he would ask her to sing. And one night, as Virginia was singing, there was a slight cough, and then there was a drop of blood on her lips. And Poe suddenly realized that his love was going to die of tuberculosis, just like his mother, his foster mother, and his brother had. Not to mention his first love, who died of brain cancer. So everyone Poe loved died of either brain cancer or tuberculosis. And so, because he experienced this horrific death so many times in the people that he loved, he knew that there's no other outcome for Virginia than death. And so it took her 5 years to die, and these were 5 years of sheer hell for Edgar Allan Poe. In 1845, The Raven was published, and this happened in the midst of his private hell. He earned only $14 for The Raven. He was very poor. He only had one coat and one shirt for many years. And The Raven, have you guys heard of The Raven before? The poem by Edgar Allan Poe?
I have.
Yeah, and you know, in The Raven, there's this refrain or this statement that's said over and over again, and it's quote the raven nevermore, and that means he's never going to see his love again, the man the raven is talking to. And so, The Raven tells us the story of a tragic character losing his lost love. And in The Raven, his lost love is named Lenore. Now, Poe is projecting forward to the soon-to-be loss of his wife, Virginia. So just as in Masque of the Red Death, he's writing about tuberculosis, in The Raven, he's writing about how he's going to lose Virginia. And so The Raven is a kind of rehearsal for his own bereavement or loss of Virginia, and to drink heavily as his wife was ill. And so Poe would never recover from the loss of Virginia. He would weep at her grave at all hours of the day and cry himself to sleep. And Poe even wrote another poem about Virginia called Annabel Lee. Now, Poe only lived till he was 40 years old, and life was a terrible struggle for him. Poe said that women had been angels of mercy to him, while men stood aloof, which means apart from him, and mocked him. And Poe was often sick or drunk or both. And so we can see what a change happened to Poe from the time he was 15, when he swam against the current in the river, to the time that he was 40, and he was often drunk or both. He lost all of his loved ones to disease. His once riveting lectures became laughable because of his drunken state. And the people who saw him last in the city of Richmond commented about how sick and pale he looked. So isn't it interesting that in Masque of the Red Death character looks pale and ill like a corpse, and Poe looks that way here at the end of his life. He was found on a Baltimore street after 3 days of not knowing where he was. He was half conscious, and Poe was rushed to the hospital, and he was delirious, and a few days later he died at the age of 40. So that was Edgar Allan Poe's life, and we can see how the happenings in his life had lent themselves to his literary genius. So, discuss Poe's suffering. I just said a lot of stuff. So, what caused Poe's mental anguish, his suffering over his life?
The death of many of his loved ones.
That's exactly right. Now, discuss the extent to which Poe's literature mirrors his own life.
A lot of his literature usually mirrors his life by being very sad, very it shows a lot of suffering.
Great. And if Poe's life had been easy, do you think his literature would have been different?
Yes, I think that it would.
Okay, good. All right, so we're going to talk about the essay that I'm going to write on Masque the Red Death, and here is the prompt. And I'm going to ask Mrs. Campbell to jump in whenever she wants and say anything she likes about the essay. So here's the prompt. Edgar Allan Poe wrote Masque of the Red Death as an allegory for the topic of avoidance. And we've already talked about cosmic irony, and we've already talked about Prince Prospero's avoidance, attempted avoidance of death. And many of you have said that death is unavoidable. It can't be locked out. And so it's kind of futile to try, kind of pointless to try. So begin your response by summarizing what you think is the story's allegorical meaning, which means the symbolic meaning behind the surface narrative. The surface narrative is basically a prince locks himself in a palace and has a masquerade ball and dies. The allegorical meaning is the symbolic meaning. Something like, we can't lock death out, or you could talk about cosmic irony in the sense that in trying to destroy the idea of death, the prince destroys himself. In trying to avoid death, he destroys himself. So that could be the allegorical meaning of the story. Now, additionally, another level of allegory in the story may have to do with tuberculosis itself and how the Red Death is tuberculosis, which is never stated in the story, but it's implied. So, be sure to cite at least 3 examples from Masque of the Red Death. So you have this prompt, and the prompt is summarize what you think is the story's allegorical meaning, and then explain what you interpret are the consequences of avoidance according to the story. Be sure to cite at least 3 examples from Masque of the Red Death. All right, so that's the prompt. I think we've covered that pretty well. Mrs. Campbell, is there anything you'd like to say about that prompt?
Well, and allegory is one of those really difficult concepts that we introduce at the 10th grade year, but it's kind of easy if you think of it in terms of archetype. So in the ninth grade year, hopefully you got some information about archetypes, and the way that death is described, the whole Masque death, that is an archetype as well. If you've watched any of the Christmas Carol movies made, the Masque is pretty much the same as what the third uh, ghost of the Christmas future was going to be. It's an archetype. So for an allegory, it's what the story is saying about human life and the human condition. And my recommendation is to see if you can come up with a movie that or a TV program, something where the bad guy of the story kind of gets it in the end, even though he does everything he can to avoid being killed, and yet he may be the one that dies the most gruesome way. And if you can make that comparison, that really helps you kind of understand what the allegory is. So you definitely want the citations from the story, but if you can think of another example as well where this allegory is taking place, you can actually kind of compare them, and that might be easy for you to do in that sense. You will be getting one of the lessons before you actually write the essay is how you incorporate those details into the paragraph. So be sure to look out for that and to watch that video. So I think that's all I have to say. Was there anybody who had any questions about the prompt or what they're being asked to do? Nope, from Bianca.
Okay.
No, from Sean.
What I'd like to do is look at another slide concerning the essay. Then, if nobody has any questions, and we've talked about what Prospero tries to avoid. We know that already, and we know what happens as a result. And so, I get asked all the time, how long should the essay be? I'll bet $1 million Mrs. Campbell gets asked that same thing.
Yes,
and
definitely.
So, since the prompt asks you to cite 3 examples from the story, the essay should be at least 5 paragraphs in length, 1 citation from the story per body paragraph. So basically what I'm looking for as a minimum, and this may be, Mrs. Campbell may agree with this, or she may want to change this requirement in some way for her students, but what as a minimum for the essay is the introduction paragraph, where you set up the essay, you introduce what it is you're going to talk about in the body paragraphs. You've got a strong thesis statement in the introduction, and then the second paragraph is going to be a body paragraph, and that paragraph will have 1 citation from Masque of the Red Death in it. And if you're going to do what Mrs. Campbell suggests and discussing a film or another story that has to do with the same kind of avoidance, you may want to incorporate a citation from that film or story as well within that paragraph. And then the next paragraph is another body paragraph with another citation from the story, or a citation also from another story that you find has a parallel to this one. And then the next paragraph will be another body paragraph with a citation. So we have 3 body paragraphs, each with a citation from Masque of Red Death and perhaps another story as well. And then the conclusion paragraph in which you sum things up. So that's the minimum I see, a 5-paragraph essay, because we're talking about using 3 citations, 1 in each body paragraph. So as a minimum, that's what I see. If you want to write more, feel free to. I'd be happy to read more, but I just wanted to discuss the structure of the essay now. Any questions about that?
One of the things I wanted to add was that remember that the prompt asks you to summarize the story, but that doesn't mean we want, paragraphs and paragraphs of it. Just summarize the plot of the story, just the basic part of it, and probably the introduction is the best place for that to be.
Good point. So are there any questions?
Nope. And not from me.
Okay. Well, then I know Mrs. Campbell and I look forward to reading your fine essays.
Yes. And this session will be posted. Like I said before, you do not have to go back and listen to it. If you wanted to, you're using the same rubrics for the Socratic seminar, right, Mr. Short?
Yes.
So there is kind of extra credit thrown in here if you want to go back and respond to the discussion board question and to a couple other people, and then maybe a paragraph as to what you got out of this session. You can actually double your points, but everybody who is here right now automatically gets 25 points.
Okay, and one last thing. If you're in my class and you're here in the Socratic seminar, would you please do me the favor of inboxing me saying you were here so I can make sure to get your points and won't forget.
Okay. All right. Well, it is 3:02, so we should probably cut this off now.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Mrs. Campbell, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you for running this. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.